Another one we can tick off for this fine government.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, happy to take a quick call on this Education Amendment Bill number 4. It may or may not be quick, depending on how I go. Alan Peachy, I know, wants me to take the full 10 minutes. I think he's sitting. He looks like he's sitting on the edge of his seat. He can't wait for me to get into it. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party supports this bill. That's right. Well, the Labour Party supports this bill, but I have to say I do have some concerns. But before I move into those, I want to talk particularly about the importance of transparency around the setting of student levies, student services levies. I think that increased transparency around that is very important. The students' ability to understand what they're paying for and to have some say in what they get charged for in student services is very important. In my time at Victoria University, I had a huge amount to do with the student services at Victoria University, paid for out of a levy which covered student health, student counselling, a variety of services that I think we all in the House would agree are really important things to provide to students, and therefore it's important that they be paid for. The question, of course, that remains is if the Minister uses his power under this law that we're about to pass to cap the amount of money that student services can charge for those services by way of a levy, that leaves them with two options, really: to increase the user charges or to cut student services. And I know what's most likely to happen. Actually, the most likely thing to happen there, unless the university or the polytechnic or the institution came to the party and increased the wānanga, what was that?
Why don't they go and get some more members?
I'm not sure what Paul Quinn's talking about. He's saying, why don't they go and get some more members? Well, they can't go and get more students. The institutions can't go and get more students, Paul Quinn, because his government have capped the number of students that an institution can enrol. So I think maybe... I noticed that Paul Quinn's finally woken up. It looked like he was dozing off there. He might want to go back into his slumber lest he look like more of an idiot than he already does. But, Mr Speaker, the issue that we have here is that the universities, or the tertiary institutions, the polytechnics, the wānanga, will have a choice between increasing levies, and if they can't increase levies to pay for the increased cost of student services, they can introduce more part charges, more user charges to students, or they can cut them. And having had a reasonable amount of seen what the universities and the polytechnics have done in the past, I think that they're most likely to cut the student services, and I think that would be a great tragedy. So I think the critical issue in tertiary education is making sure that the institutions are adequately resourced to deliver all of the services that they need to, and that includes student services, some of which are paid for by way of levy and some of which are cross-subsidised from tuition fees. There's absolutely a cross-subsidy between tuition fees and student services, because some student services are integral to actually the ability to deliver academic programs. For example, the provision of student computing facilities. It's a student service, but it's absolutely integral to the ability of a student to undertake their course of study. Now, in some institutions, there may be some levy costs associated with that. In other institutions, it will simply be paid for out of the tuition fees. Transparency around that is important, and this bill delivers greater transparency around that, and I think that's very important. I want to talk about what potentially is a significant increase in student levies that's coming up around the corner if this government have their way and pass Heather Roy's bill, which will introduce voluntary student membership. Because at the moment, the Students' Association membership is a levy, and if the institutions pick up the services provided by students' associations, they will almost certainly fund that by way of a levy. Now, in 1999, when students were given a choice between whether they wanted a compulsory or a voluntary regime for students' associations, they overwhelmingly voted for compulsory associations. It's always useful to remember that. But the Victoria University, where I studied, decided that they would provide many of the services the Students' Association provide if voluntary membership was voted for. They would still provide subsidies for clubs, they'd still provide a certain number of activities and so on. They were going to levy students for that. Their levy was going to deliver fewer services and cost more than the Students' Association levy was going to cost, because they couldn't do it as cheaply. And this is the very real prospect that tertiary institutions are going to face next year. If this government passes the bill that they promised that they wouldn't, but that they are now saying that they will, then the institutions are going to face a very real dilemma. Do they increase the levies that students pay, Or do they cut the services? Do they simply accept that those services are going to go? And I suspect that in a lot of cases, students will end up paying more for less. One way or the other, they'll end up paying more in order to get less. That's one of the downsides of voluntary Students' Association membership. There are many others, but we will come to those, I'm sure, when the VSM bill ends up being debated in the House again. But transparency around the way those levies are set is going to be very important. Another concern, of course, is that students at the moment have a real say on how the levies are set, because the levies charged by a tertiary institution are ultimately determined by their governing body, the governing council. And students at the moment are guaranteed representation on that governing body. And in most instances where there is a strong students' association, that is done through the students' association. With a voluntary regime, there's no guarantee that the quality of student representation will be maintained, and therefore students may not have that effective voice in having their say in the way that the levies, the student services levies fixed by institutions, are set, and I think that that would be a great tragedy. So we support the parts of this bill that introduce greater transparency around the setting of student services levies, because we've seen a significant increase in student services levies under this government, up 600% at Canterbury University, 600% at Canterbury University under this government, and I think that's something that there should be a great amount of scrutiny around, because one of the concerns that students will of course be expressing is in an environment where institutions are choked of funding by this national government, one option that they have is to increase their revenue by increasing the amount that students pay directly for services through increased student services levies. So placing a greater control on that is important, but of course that doesn't remedy the problem. It puts a control on transfer of cost to students, doesn't remedy the problem of where the institutions get the money to provide those services from in the first place. And if the government aren't willing to front up with the funding, that creates very real dilemmas for the institutions. The price of tertiary education, the amount that students are forking out, has gone up 18% since National took office. And student services levies, of course, are only one of the causes of that, tuition fees being the lion's share of that. Increased costs for tertiary education means increased student loan balances, longer repayment times. There are a whole lot of other reasons why we don't want, that is a bad idea. We want to bring the cost of tertiary education down. And of course, this is what the government, the National Party, campaigned at the last election on bringing down the cost of tertiary education. Well, you're not hearing them talking, no one's hearing them talking about that anymore. They're not talking about bringing down the cost of tertiary education anymore, because the irrefutable evidence is, it's absolutely clear that the cost of tertiary education under this national government has gone up by over 18% since they took office. So they haven't kept their promise to keep students, to keep their cost to students down. And some of the measures that they are proposing to do, including voluntary Students' Association membership and further capping of the funding for tertiary institutions, is only going to exacerbate that problem. To briefly talk about some of the other aspects of the bill that the Labour Party supports, we do support the establishment of the new export education body. That's a good thing. I would encourage the government to keep Murray McCully as far away from it as they possibly can. He's got plenty of other things that he likes to meddle in, and I think he could keep his hands off the export education industry. It seems to be doing pretty well. Well, Murray McCully, I agree with Jonathan Coleman. Murray McCully is incredibly arrogant. He's possibly the most arrogant minister in the government. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that Murray McCully be kept as far away from international education as is possible. Maestro over there. Maybe they should let Maestro take over international education, and if he did as good a job of that as he did of running Melissa Lee's campaign in Mount Albert, I want Jonathan Coleman to come and run the National Party campaign in my electorate. I really would like that. I'd be quite happy to pay for his airfares to come and run the Rimataka National Party's campaign. I'd be in a landslide after the fantastic job that he did in Mount Albert. Mr. Speaker, overall, to return to the bill that we're debating, the Education Amendment Bill number 4, as tempting as it is to continue to talk about Jonathan Coleman just because there's so much material there to work with. The Labour Party supports the Education Amendment Bill number 2. This is the final reading of it, and we're very happy to support it.
Colin King.
Mr. Speaker,